Good morning, everyone. I am Jonathan J. Reinhardt from Wargaming Recon, hosting today's seminar, seminar on game design for the Let's Roll Virtual Gaming Convention 2020. We have all sorts of events today and games that you can play. Please check us out online at letsrollcon.com. It's a one-day convention, May 16, 2020, from 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But that aside, I am joined by someone really special who is the reason that you're all here, because you're not here for me. I mean, I wouldn't be here for me either. You are here because you want to learn about game design, and we have Mr. Robey Jenkins here to talk about it. Robey, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Hi there. How are you doing, Jonathan?
I'm doing really well. People may or may not be completely familiar with who you are and your work. So why don't you just do a brief mention about who you are, and let's introduce everyone to you.
Yeah, okay. So my name's Robey, and I write games for a living. And it's I've been writing games for quite a long time. I've only been doing it full time for the last few months. I'll look at them in a little bit more detail when we get into the presentation. But yeah, I've probably written complete games. I've probably written about half a dozen over the last 10 years or so. But the odds are, if you've heard of any of them, you've probably only heard of maybe one or two, because a lot of them either never made it to market or they crashed and burned so spectacularly that the number of people who will have heard of them, I could probably count on one hand.
Okay. For anyone who is watching live, you can definitely leave comments in the comment box below, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll be monitoring that and seeing it. But Robey, you have a whole presentation that you want to do for us, and I believe you have some slides to share. Is that right?
I'm gonna see if I can get this working now. Hold on. Let's see if we can make this happen. I'll do that. Hold on. Come on. Wakey. That one. So if I share that.
Awesome.
Oops. And do that. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, here we go.
Okay. All right. Shall I take it from here, Jonathan?
Please do.
We'll take it from here. And I'm going to watch my time really carefully. Listen. So, guys, just before we kick off, what I'm looking at here is a very whistle-stop tour of the process of game design from start to market. There's a lot of information in here. A lot of it is very much sort of skipped over some big areas. So I'm only going to be skirting along the surface. I'm going to try really hard to get through this quickly enough that there's time at the end to ask questions. I am looking at expanding this seminar into something a bit more detailed and a bit more heavy. This is very much early days for that. So sort of watch this space, and maybe there'll be more in the future if people are interested. So a quick intro to who am I and why should you care? The two games that you may have heard of that I am responsible for. The first is this one, Horizon Wars, science fiction combined arms wargaming, is a 2 to 10 mil miniatures sci-fi warfare game published in 2016 by Osprey Games. So I have published through, as it might be said, the conventional, traditional pathway. Much more recently, I published Horizon Wars Zero Dark, which is a 28 mil skirmish science fiction game, which I have self-published. So having seen publishing through the traditional lens, I've also now seen what it is to get to market through the self-publishing pathway. And even though these are the two games for which I am known, if I'm known for anything, this, as I said at the start, is not my first rodeo when it comes to game design. I have written role-play games and card games and board games. It's just that miniatures games is where I have actually managed to make any kind of market impact. It's the area that I speak with the greatest authority on, but I've tried to make sure the content of this presentation is relevant to both miniatures games and other kinds of games that you may be interested in writing. My assumption is that if you're watching this, you are, to some extent, interested in writing your own designs of games in some form or another, and I'm assuming that you've probably made a stab at it here along the way. As I say, every slide that follows could be a seminar in and of its own right. Just very briefly, so that you've got a bigger picture of the idea of who I am. Before I moved into game design, after I left university, I joined the British Army. I went to Sandhurst, which is our equivalent of your West Point in the States. I commissioned as a lieutenant in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and I spent 7 years in uniform before the Army and I, as I like to say, took a good, long, hard look at each other and decided it was time to go our separate ways. After that, I worked in a range of companies as a human resources specialist, and it's fair to say that I was fairly well regarded in my little market as a people strategist. But a few months ago, I decided that it was time to take the leap, and I am now writing games full time. So that is who I am and why you might possibly care. So let's stop talking about me and let's start talking about you, because the first question I want to ask is, why design your own game? Now, this might seem like a redundant question if you are already designing your own game, but actually I think it's really important to the process that if you are trying to write a game, you take time to articulate to yourself, if no one else, what it is that you're trying to get from writing your own game. And as I've sort of looked at it and boiled it down, I really see two key drivers that come together that should be pushing you in different levels to write a game if you've got one in your head. The first one is what I call the negative drive. The negative drive is that there is a gap in the game market that you want to fill. It might be that you have a game that you want to play that doesn't exist, so you want to write it. Or it might be that you've looked at the market, seen, why is there no game that does this, or has this setting, or is at this scale, or addresses this particular battle or war or period, whatever it might be, and therefore you're going to write it. The negative drive. Gap filling, essentially. Now, there is nothing wrong with trying to fill a gap in the market. Commercially, it's a very good idea. But generally speaking, if gap filling is your priority drive, then design tends to suffer as a result. And I won't go into detail on that, but if you are familiar with any TV or movie tie-in board or miniatures games, you can probably think of an example where the end result has suffered because the object was to deliver a game to market and fill a gap rather than to deliver a good game. That's the negative drive. It's not a bad drive to having a negative drive, but it's maybe not the starting point that you should lean upon. By contrast, we've got the positive drive. Now, if you're a fan, as I am, of the writings of Terry Pratchett, you may have heard of the concept of the inspiration particle. The inspiration particle sleeps through the universe until it strikes a receptive, sapient mind. And at that point, it explodes into a shower of inspiration, and the recipient brain is compelled to act upon it. And this is where many novels, for example, come from. And in this respect, game writing is very like the act of writing a novel, that you have inspiration for a game. And damn it, you're going to write that game. You don't care if there's a gap in the market. You don't care if anybody else wants to play it. You don't even care if the game has been written before. You have the inspiration. You've got the compulsion. You're going to write the game. The positive drive is great when it comes to delivering a high-quality game. It's not so good when it comes to delivering a product that is going to be commercially successful. And this is what I mean about needing to have a balance between the negative drive and the positive drive. So if you're already working on a game, I would encourage you to take time after this presentation to think about, in relation to your game, what's my negative drive? What's the gap in the market that I'm trying to fill? But at the same time, have I got the positive drive? Have I got the passion, the compulsion to write a game that is going to meet my vision and leave me satisfied that I have responded appropriately to the inspiration particle that struck my receptive brain? Okay. That's all I'm going to leave on those two things. Just balance those out in your own head before you move on. The other thing that people often don't think about when they set out designing games, I say other people don't think about, let's be honest, that I didn't think about at all when I was setting out to write a game, was the resources that I was going to need. And resources are things that you can underestimate. The first and most important is time and space, which obviously anybody familiar with Einstein will know they're the same thing, but not in game design terms. Looking back on my own experiences and having discussed it with other game designers when I've had the chance, I would say it's not completely inaccurate to say that you're not going to spend more than about 25% of your time in a game design process actually writing the game. Far more of your time is going to be spent in research, in playtesting, in just straight sitting and thinking hard about what you're doing. And it always takes longer than you expect. That's the other thing to remember. It doesn't matter how much you plan. It doesn't matter how much extra you plan into your schedule. It will always take longer than it seems to need at the beginning of the process. And it always seems to take up more room than you expect as well. You think, this is just a small game. I'm playing it on a 2 foot by 2 foot space, or it's just a board game, or it's just a card game. And yet somehow the components and the materials, they expand and they take over your house and your room and your office and your car. And you're going, how did this happen? I don't say that to discourage you, but just be aware that entering into a game design process consumes both time and space. And if you don't have time in your life or you don't have space, you're going to need to make room for that, or just accept that this is not something that's going to happen very, very quickly. Components. I've got some miniatures up there, but components can be anything. A really easy source of components, of course, are the games that you already own. And they are bound to give you all sorts of cards and counters and chits that you can turn to use in whatever game you're working on. You may, however, find yourself needing to make your own components, custom components. A classic one being cards, if you're going to use cards in your game somehow. The amount of time I seem to have spent cutting up sheets of cardboard into smaller sheets of cardboard would have astonished me when I was starting out in the game design process. So think about whether you've got the resources to make the components for the game that you're designing. Now, if you're a hobby designer, if you're just writing games for your own personal satisfaction and maybe for a few of your friends to come around and throw down on the dining room table once in a while, you know, you can pretty much stop here. But if you've got any aspiration at all to write games commercially, then listen on. Because you are at some point going to need some hardware. A laptop, desktop are great, but you'll find just as you go along, you'll think, oh, I could really do with a printer, or I need a laminator, or I need a laser pointer for this game. Oh, I'm going to need a 3D printer to do some rapid prototyping. Oh, I'm going to need a video camera to make demos for YouTube, whatever it might be. The amount of hardware you need always seems to expand somehow. And you need to bear in mind that, of course, all of this comes at a cost. Game design is not necessarily a cheap process if you're seeking to do it commercially. And inside the hardware, of course, comes the software. The one I've just shown up there is one of my favorites, although I know many people despise it. That's Adobe InDesign for making a good-looking set of well-laid out products. InDesign has been, for me, an invaluable tool. I initially started out just using Microsoft Word. I've actually moved now. When I'm just writing, when I'm just making notes, my software, I just use Google Docs. I can access it anywhere, on my laptop, on my phone, on my wife's laptop, or wherever it might be. I can always access my Google Docs to make notes. But when it comes to actually compiling a product that I'm going to put into the hands of customers, I turn to Adobe InDesign. There are cheaper versions. There are free versions of the same sort of software out there. Scribus is one that you may have come across. But InDesign, in terms of user friendliness and the quality of the UX and the amount of tutorials online and help you can find to get you through it, is really very, very good indeed. Image editing software is something else that I have used more than I would have expected when I started out designing miniatures. Designing games. And I have had to become, not an expert certainly, but I have had to have become a knowledgeable amateur when it comes to image editing and image editing software. Of course, learning to use all of this stuff takes time that we raised at the start. Time that you didn't expect at the beginning of the process, but it builds in as you go along. Now, before I move on and start talking about game design itself, I do want to emphasize you don't need all of this stuff to write a game. You can write a game on the back of an envelope. You can write a game in a notebook you keep in your pocket. Still, if you have aspirations to write a game that has any kind of permanent or commercial form, you need to think about whether you've got these resources, where you can get them, and how much they're going to cost you to make things work the way you want it to. I'm already behind schedule, so let me move on rapidly. So the process of design itself. I talked about articulating your drives. Once you've done that, absolutely vital that you articulate your vision for your game design and keep on coming back to it. This is something I used to teach in business to business leaders about articulating your vision and using it as a signpost whenever you've got a difficult decision to make. Go back to your vision. Which direction leads quickest to my vision? The vision in game design, I see it as a twofold thing. The first is, what does play feel like? And it can feel like a number of different things. It can be one of these long-form, full narrative arcs that you play out scene by scene, like Diplomacy or Twilight Imperium, for example. It could be more like a TV series, where each game represents an episode with a connecting narrative. You might have tried Kingdom Death, or any of the legacy series of games that are very much like this. I'd even put the solo mode of my own game, Zero Dark, firmly into this category. Or each game is just an episode of a series like Black Mirror or Twilight Zone that stands on its own. Each game is one distinct narrative arc, and then you go back and start again. Game I played recently that really fits into this mold is Pandemic Rapid Response, just like an episode of a TV series. Or you may be playing out an action scene in your game. Most miniatures games are like this, but although traditionally an action scene involves, war and guns and violence, it doesn't have to. An action scene in a game could describe a court battle or an emotional exchange, either way. So articulate for yourself what your game is going to feel like. And I just want to illustrate with a still from a movie that I watched some years ago, which really kick-started the design process for Zero Dark. I don't know if you recognize this still or this movie. It is from the cinematic trailer for Ghost Recon Alpha, computer game. And when I saw this movie, it's about 35 minutes long. You can find it on YouTube, search for Ghost Recon Alpha. It is by far the highest quality sci-fi military movie I have ever seen. It is absolutely spectacular. And I hope if any of you have played Zero Dark, or you buy and go on and play Zero Dark in the future, you will see design cues from this short movie in Zero Dark. It was everything that I wanted in a game was here. So I kept on going back to this movie. I watched it, probably a dozen times in the process of design, just to make sure that I was staying true to my vision. Now, once you've articulated what your game feels like, the next thing you need to do is fully embrace what it's going to look like. And when I say look like, I mean physically look like in the real world. How many players can you have? Because more players will bring different expectations, and you'll need a different kind of a space to play the game. Is it a standing game where people are going to be moving around, perhaps looking at the board from different angles or interacting with each other? Or is it a sitting game where people stay in one place and they are more contemplative? I like this one. Is it a laughing game or a thinking game? Generally speaking, more random means more laughing, less random means more thinking. But not necessarily. So there are games like, for example, Cards Against Humanity that has no real random generator other than the turn of the cards, yet obviously it's a laughing game. I'm sure I could think of a thinking game that also had a lot of randomness if I took my mind to it. And also, importantly, where is the focus of the game? When you imagine people either sitting or standing or laughing or thinking, in the course of playing your game, where does their focus lie? And to give the two classic counterpoints to this example, In chess, the focus is the board. It may even be a section of the board. The players themselves look at one another very little. The board is the focus. Compare and contrast with poker. Yes, you've got a hand of cards, but most poker players are going to look at their cards, put them down, never look at them again. They know what they've got. Their focus is on the other players. And they are seeking to understand from looking at the behavior and the tells of that other players what's going on. So the focus there is outwards, whereas the focus in chess is inwards. There we are. And to illustrate, as I illustrated with Ghost Recon what my game felt like, here is an illustration of not my game, I hasten to add, but what tabletop miniatures games certainly used to look like. I hope you're all aware that H.G. Wells, father of science fiction, was also the father of miniatures wargaming. And this is an illustration of him and some of his friends playing one of their indoor war games. And you can see clearly that Wells articulated through this picture exactly what his game looked like, as well as what it felt like. And my word, are those not the most overdressed wargamers you have ever seen? The one in the back is wearing spats. Any of you ever worn spats to play war games? Half the time we're underdressed. Anyway, we're still men playing with dollies at the end of the day. And women, I should add. I'm going to get shot if I don't put that in. Okay, talking about the process of design then. When we've articulated our vision, what it feels like, what it looks like, we're finally getting to the process of mechanics. And the reason I wanted to put it in that order was because people often dive into the mechanics. And if you're designing a game right now, you've probably got mechanics already laid out. And if you have, that's great. Doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. But I would strongly encourage you to go back, look at the drivers behind your design, then articulate the vision of your design, what it feels like, what it looks like. Now look again at your mechanics and say, do my mechanics match my vision? And if they do, great, you can move on. But as you work through your mechanics, you do need to make sure that everything feeds back to the vision. So the role of the role, I couldn't resist a pathetic pun, I'm sorry. What we're talking about here is randomization. And of all the topics in this seminar, if anyone could almost be a whole course of seminars in its own, it's randomization in tabletop games. So I will try very hard not to get too wrapped up in this. Dice are marvelous. The single best dice is the D12. I will brook no arguments on that particular fact. It just is a fact. Just move on. Dice, linear, bell curve, tail ends, all the good statistical stuff you can get out of dice are marvelous. But it is not the be-all and the end-all of randomization. There are many options. A classic that is starting to return to popularity is the chit draw system. Now, the traditional chit draw is there's a pile of paper chits, each have got something written on it. They go into a bag, you pull out a chit, and whatever is written on it is what happens on the tabletop. Okay? It's a classic randomness approach. But there are several manifestations of the chit draw lately that are really bringing it back into attention. The first is, if any of you have played collectible card games, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic the Gathering, anything like that, it is fundamentally a chit draw system. That's not really a deck of cards. That is a bag of chits. You draw those chits into your hand, and then you play those chits. Okay. Other chit draw system that I've seen recently, Peak Oil had an excellent one of oil barrels of different colors in a bag that you would draw, and they had different effects. And of course, Bolt Action, a miniatures game that has a chit draw system, but rather than chits, it's got dice. You draw orders dice from a bag, and whichever color of dice is drawn tells you whose player gets to play that order. Classic chit draw system. The marvelous thing about chit draw versus dice is that as you draw chits, you alter the odds. Because if you remove a chit from the bag, the number of chits left in the bag is fewer, and therefore the probabilities change the more chits that you draw. And then you can influence that by having chits that come out and then go back in, which is something that Peak Oil does. Brilliant system, chit draw. Not used enough. Playing cards. Playing cards feature in Zero Dark because they have such an enormous variety of potential randomization factors. So classic playing cards have 2 colors, red and black. They've got 4 suits, clubs, diamonds, hearts, spades. They've got 13 values from ace through to king. They've got 2 jokers. They've got numbers versus faces. You can play aces high or aces low. It goes on. I could get quite excited about cards, but actually, if you are thinking about using playing cards as a randomization mechanic, I would point you towards Yes, Zero Dark, which does it. Also, Malifaux is a popular game that also makes a great use of playing cards. Malifaux is an interesting example because certainly in a previous edition, haven't played the new edition, I'm not sure, it almost went too far down the rabbit hole. One of the great appeals of cards is they've got all these different randomization structures. One of the great challenges is if you use them to excess, it begins to dominate the rest of the game. And instead of having a game where you've got a randomization mechanic, you have a randomization mechanic that also has a game. So beware of that if you're using cards. And there are endless others that you can draw upon. Moving on, the next thing after thinking about your randomization mechanics and its place in the game is the simplicity versus complexity dichotomy in your design. Generally speaking, simple is better, especially when it comes to the rules. But at the same time, complexity has its attractions. Simplicity means people can access the rules more quickly, they can get onto the tabletop faster, but complexity allows you to wrap things up in the rules that keeps the tabletop activity more constricted. One of the challenges we often see is that components expand rapidly in order to keep the rules simple. I call this Fantasy Flight syndrome. If you've played a Fantasy Flight game, the designers at Fantasy Flight, and in many branches of Asmodee, but particularly Fantasy Flight, whenever they hit a design challenge, their solution seems to be to add more components. And they can get away with that because they're a big company. They've got fantastic production values. And I should say, I love Fantasy Flight games. Battlestar Galactica, their board game, is one of my favorite ever board games. But the volume of components is overwhelming. But to overcome their design challenges, they added components. My tendency as a designer is generally to avoid components and, if necessary, backload that complexity into the rules. But it's the dynamic that you've got to manage. The challenge is when it comes with immersion. The more immersed you are in the game, the less inclined you are to want to engage with the rules. This is D&D combat syndrome. You're engaged within your game, you're enjoying your game, and then all of a sudden you get into a combat, everything grinds to a halt, and you've got to start adding things up. Okay. So be wary of the break in immersion that excessive rules can cause, and complexity can cause. And lastly, and this perhaps is where something like Battlestar Galactica struggles, is the question of replayability. If your game is so complex that it takes you an hour just to set up before you start, then maybe you've got too much complexity in your components, because that's going to discourage people from wanting to play the game again. And if you're a game designer at heart, yes, you might like to make money out of your game, you might want to make a living from writing games, but ultimately what you want is people to play your games. You don't want to be what I call the 50 Shades of games, a game that everybody buys, makes lots of money, but nobody's ever going to play twice, as 50 Shades discovered. Should never have been written. Right, so that's simplicity versus complexity. Very quickly, let me move on to the third part. Now, mechanics is going to occupy you a lot as a designer, but everybody's approach to mechanics is slightly different. I could expand on the different approaches many times, but I want to gloss over that and move on to a problem that faces all game designers eventually, which is that of playtesting. The big question that I always get asked, and I wouldn't be surprised if somebody wants to ask this at the end, is how do you find playtesters? So I will tell you now, it's very difficult. That's all I'm going to say on the subject. It is difficult. But before you even worry about that, solo testing. All games should be tested solo, first of all. There are 3 levels of solo testing. The first is conceptual. Conceptual testing takes place predominantly inside your head. At most, you may be sketching things out on a piece of paper. This is when you are working out odds and probabilities, when you're imagining circumstances that may want to come up in the game. You're feeding back to your vision. Do you remember what the game feels like, what the game looks like? How do you marry those two up? That's conceptual testing. The next is mechanical testing. And that is, from my perspective, for my kinds of games, this generally involves me sitting at a table with a couple of models, a few obstacles, a pile of dice and a tape measure. And I just set up scenarios, roll dice, see if they work, look at the terrain, think, this is what I would like to be able to happen. How am I going to do it? And that's your mechanical testing. Okay? Taking your mechanics you've got, seeing how well they apply on the tabletop. Last, in solo testing, is experiential testing. That's when you start playing through sections of games, not necessarily a whole game. You'll play your early game, you'll play your mid game, you'll play your end game. You'll set up circumstances that could arise in the game and play through them to see how they work. Nobody else wants to do that with you. Nobody else understands the game well enough. You've got to do this stuff on your own. Once you've worked your way through that, you've settled the concepts, you're happy with the mechanics, the experience feels right, you are ready to move on to team testing. Team testing is predominantly experiential, but partly mechanical. And I'd say it's about 90-10, 80-20, something like that. So it's fundamentally should be about the experience. Does the experience that you have in team testing map back to your original vision? And if not, why not? Mechanically, stuff will come out. Inevitably, as soon as you put your game into somebody else's hands, things will come up that you have not previously thought of, that you thought were settled but weren't, that you need to address. By and large, however, by the time you get to this point, this should be tinkering. There should be, oh yeah, I could add that, or oh yeah, I could change that, and tweaking and fixing rather than building things from scratch. It does happen though, so be prepared at level 1 team testing, which I'll talk about in a moment, to go back to the drawing board if you need to. You can always restart solo testing at any time and come back to team testing later. Level 1 team testing is you and other people playing together. So you are there to teach the game, to guide the game, to answer any questions, to make notes as you go along. Level 1 testing, you are still a player. Level 2 testing is setting up other people to play the game and you observe. So you shouldn't at that point be teaching them to play the game. You can be taking notes. You can answer questions, but you should be really referring them to the rule book. Because if they can't find the answers in the rule book, you should be making a note and then answering their questions and moving on. This is checking. Can they find the rules? Can they find the components? Do they understand what you're trying to say without having you look over their shoulder all the time? And last of all, level 3 playtesting. This is the point at which you release your game in beta in some mode. So you may have people who've played the game before who want to play it at home with their families or with their friends, or take it out at your local club or store when you're not there. If you've got people that want to participate in level 3 testing, for heaven's sake, treasure them. They are gold dust. But don't get them involved too early. Try not to use those people at level 1 if you can avoid it. Bring them in at level 2 at the earliest. Because if you burn them out on versions 0.1 and 0.2 and 0.3 of your game, then by the time you're ready to go to level 3, they'll either have burnt out on the game and won't want to play it, or they'll be remembering all of the rules from your 0.1 and 0.2 versions that have changed, and they'll be playing the game incorrectly. You want to try and get people in at level 3, if possible, who have heard of your game, who might have tried it at level 2, but who ultimately don't know your game yet. So that's playtesting, how to go about it. How you find your playtesters, big subject, definitely one for another day. So last of all then, and I'm good, I'm on time. Last section of the process of design that I wanted to talk about is for some of us the most exciting, for some of us the one for which they're least interested. So if you're just here to know about how to write a game, you're not interested in taking your game to market or making any money off it at all, you can switch off and wait for the questions at the end if you've got any. There are, however, 3 routes to market, and we'll look at them now. The first route to market is organic. The organic route to market is simple word of mouth. You don't market your game, you don't sell your game, except if somebody comes and asks you for a copy. You play it with your friends down the club, at the local store, whatever it might be, but until somebody says, oh, can I have a copy of that? It doesn't spread. You can either charge them for it, you can get a donation to charity for it, whatever, or you can just let it circulate freely. It's entirely up to you. That's the organic route to market. And there are examples of products that have become commercially successful through organic growth, but they are few and far between. Organic growth is not a reliable route to market. It's not certainly not a reliable way to make any money. But ultimately, if you're not interested in making money, it's all you really need to do. So don't worry about your route to market. Let it take organic growth, and it's up to you. So the second one is the traditional route to market. This one, if anything, is the hardest. As I said at the start, my first breakthrough game was published by Osprey Games. There are very few publishers of freelance game designs from people who don't already have an established reputation in game design. Particularly if you're here because you're interested in miniatures games, I only know of 2, and that's Osprey Games and Modiphius Entertainment. And not sure about Modiphius as well. That's tricky. So it's not easy to get in there. If you are interested in a traditional route to market, ultimately 2 things come into play. The first is networking, and the second is pure blind chance. So networking simply means knowing people in the business. Get to know them. Find them on Facebook. Follow them on Twitter. Comment on their posts. If you can, catch up with them on LinkedIn. Let them see you as a professional gamer if that's what you're prepared to be on LinkedIn. Meet them at conventions, at events. If they're there on a stand, go and chat, play their games, talk about them, become engaged. That kind of process takes a very long time. I mean, it really is the process of years. In my case, I mean, I was probably networking in and around the world of miniatures games. Well, I mean, because I've been playing it all of my life in a sense, but in a professional way, probably for about a decade before I had a breakthrough. And pure blind chance comes into play. In my case, I had finished Horizon Wars. It was a compilation of 3 other games that I had written, and I was about to self-publish. By chance, I happened to have the email address of Phil Smith, the editor at Osprey Games, and I thought, oh, well, before I self-publish, I'll just see if Phil's interested. And I dropped him an email, said, I've done this. Would you be interested in taking a look? And he came back very quickly and said, as it happens, we've been looking for a game like that. I'd be very interested. And that was it. The chance element was I happened to have his contact details. He happened to be looking for that game. And the other element of chance was he happened to have seen some of my posts about game design on a wargaming forum. And those 3 things came together that meant he was prepared to give my game a look. Okay? Traditional publishing route is great in a sense. You've got a publisher that does all the hard work for you, but it also has its downsides. 1, it's very hard to break into. 2, you're never going to retire on the proceeds. You're barely going to cover your costs. You don't have traditional publishing, not in game design. The last one is modern. I say modern because it's the new way. It is, of course, self-publishing. Self-publishing had a bad name historically in books. People talk about vanity publishing. Self-publishing is far more respectable today. There are a lot of people online, companies, outlets, platforms whether it's be Lulu or One Bookshelf Inc. or who else is out there? Amazon. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend Amazon, mainly because they're Amazon. But there are many platforms out there that will help you get your game to market if you want to. And I recommend the modern route for 2 reasons. 1, it guarantees you'll get to market. 2, you get the best possible proceeds from your work. And 3, you have 100% control over the outcome. The downside is you have to do everything. All the design, all the layout, all the editing. Either you've got to find a professional and pay them, or you've got to do it yourself and learn how. Which sends us back to my original slide about time and space. So I'm on time and we're heading into our final thoughts. So just to summarize then, so that we've covered over the points from the seminar, to remind them, keep them fresh in your mind. The first, positive and negative drivers. Positive is that inspiration, that compulsive need and desire to write the game in your imagination. The negative driver is the gap-filling aspect, that you feel like there is a draw, there's something in the market that you can place your product into that means it's going to sell. Positive and negative drivers. Articulate them, think about them, have an idea about where they're coming from and where your balance lies. Articulate your vision. If you take nothing else away from this seminar, I will say this again and again and again. In life, it always makes things better if you articulate what you're trying to achieve before you start trying to achieve it. If you've already set out on your game design process, as I suspect most people have who are listening to this, then now is the time to pause and articulate that vision in 2 things. What does the game feel like? What does the game look like? Now, when you go back to your mechanics and your design, think back to your vision. Am I achieving my vision with what I'm doing in my game? Find balance. Find balance in the complexity of your rules, in the randomness, in the positive and negative drivers. Find balance between what your game feels like and what it looks like. It's not about having a balanced game that's perfect at tournaments or competition. When I say balance, the balance is in the nature of the design and how well it serves your vision. And last of all, manage your ambitions. I am fortunate to be sitting here having the opportunity to tell you my thoughts and what I think. And I told you at the start that I had decided to become a game designer full-time, and I have. The only reason that I'm able to do that is because I have built up a substantial financial buffer over the last few years. That means that I can afford to not make money for quite a long time. You will not become rich from 1 game. You will not become rich from 2 games. Do you know what? You will not become rich from any number of games. The most you can hope for from professional game design is to be making enough money that you can just design games for a living. That's it. I'm not saying it's not impossible that you could be the next E.L. James of game design. If you are, lucky you. But seriously, do not set out on game design as a profession thinking that this is going to be your retirement plan. Right. I think that's everything. And we brought that in at just under 45 minutes. I hope you can all still hear me.
Well, Robey, thank you for that. That was fascinating. And I got to say, I've talked with a lot of game designers for my show, Wargaming Recon. And none of them have been able to frame it in such an insightful way as you, in such a way that is as easy to understand as you've done with your slides. So thank you for that.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. As I say, there was so much which I could have added to that, which I had to leave out just for the purposes of time and space, as I said at the start there. So if people are interested in hearing more stuff that I had to leave out of that, please do let me know. Track me down on Facebook or Twitter and tell me so. I would love to put more time into expanding on this seminar into something more fulsome.
Speaking of people tracking you down, what online user handles or social media places can people find you at?
I am okay. Where can I get the right side of my shirt? All right. Precinct Omega is the name of the company. It is also effectively me online. I am Precinct Omega absolutely everywhere. Yeah, that's my website up on the screen there. I have to say my website is a little bit ratty at the moment. You can buy some 6mm stuff and some resin miniatures, but it's not great for games. It's due a massive overhaul, but you can find me on Facebook at Precinct Omega. You can find me on Twitter at Precinct Omega. You can find me on Instagram at Precinct Omega. You can even find me on Tumblr, but don't track me down on Tumblr, but I am there. Pinterest, actually. I would say if you're interested in game design, and you've got a Pinterest account, look at my Pinterest page because I use it as a game mood board. So you'll find pictures of art and miniatures for the various games that I have written, and quite a few for games that either I haven't published yet or are just working their way through my brain. I find image mood boards really helpful for the game design process.
We do have, if you have a few moments, we have some comments and questions from people who are watching live that I'd like to share with you, if I may.
Go.
So we have Max and Jamelli saying that he has found thrift store games a great place to scavenge for components, referring to one of your earlier slides about using stuff at home for components for games.
Yes, no, that's, and wherever you can find components is awesome. I still have components from the game itself I've lost, but I've still got all of the counters because you can always use counters. But you always do still have to remember that if you're going to produce a commercial game, at some point, those components have to turn into proprietary components of your own. You can't just box up thrift shop components with your board game.
And then we have a question here from Court, who says, do you find self-publishing leads to better playtest comments?
Ooh. I'm not sure I do at this point. Maybe because I've only sort of been self-publishing since this time last year, so maybe it needs a little bit more time in that. I'm not sure that it really makes a great deal of difference. Do you get more feedback as a self-publisher than a... No, I don't think so, is the short answer. I think you'll get better feedback. Now, I don't know about playtest comments, because by the time you've published, it's past the point of playtesting. But you get better feedback on your games if you are more engaged with your player audience. And it's true that if you're self-publishing, you tend to be better engaged because you've got to do all your own marketing. But you can be equally well engaged as a traditionally published game if you make the effort.
Okay. And then Court has another question. He says, do you find altering existing rules is a good starting point?
Well, whether altering existing rules, possibly. Certainly, house ruling is often a great place to start when you're engaging with a game and you find that it isn't doing what you want. Then, coming up with some house rules of your own to make it fit with your vision is a great way to get in there. And actually, I really sort of got my start as a rules writer. Not so much house ruling so much as writing material for other games. I used to write scenarios or missions or campaigns, even just background for games. That's kind of where I started off, writing material for magazines for other games.
And I'm just going to give it a moment in case anyone else has any questions or comments that they'd like to put in for you. And while we just wait a moment for that, I want to remind everyone that today's seminar here is being saved, so you can find it on Facebook, on the Wargaming Recon Facebook page, and also on our Wargaming Recon YouTube channel. And it will also be made available on letsrollcon.com. And Robey, you said you would make your slides available for people as well, right?
Yeah, so I've sent you, Jonathan, a PDF of the slides from that presentation. I don't know how you want to share that with people, but perhaps put it up on the Let's Roll website, perhaps.
Yeah, I believe that's where we'll probably end up getting it put up.
Yeah. So all the slides. None of my notes. You don't get to see my notes. You don't.
Oh man, I was hoping.
Don't need to see my notes. No.
This close.
Just the slides.
Just the slides. Okay. And then we have a comment here, a bit of feedback from Timothy Colonna, who says, great interview. Lots of good points. Timothy's another game designer. He's created Trilateral, which is a sci-fi
yes.
game.
Saw that on the marketplace. I will definitely be checking that out later.
And then we have a bit of feedback and a question from Ben Rose, who says, great presentation. Thank you. If you could go back and warn yourself about one thing, what would it be?
Don't get into miniatures manufacturing. That's a good one. I have nearly gone bankrupt twice now of trying to get into miniatures manufacturing. You'd think I'd have learned the first time.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. No, if you want to get into miniatures manufacturing, two things need to apply. You need to have a great deal of capital investment or an enormous amount of talent. And you have to be very, very interested in doing nothing but making miniatures all day long. If you actually want to play games, don't get into miniatures manufacturing. Just write games.
Wow, that's good to know. And then we have a question here from Max, who wants to know, can you explain why you prefer the D12 over other dice? There's a story here.
Yeah. It depends how much detail you want me to go into. Okay, Max, I'll give you the standard answer. Good question. I'll give you the standard answer. First of all, our choice of dice is D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, D20. Any other dice, forget it. I mean, D100, separate thing. D100 is a separate, in my opinion, separate question. D4 is obviously an anathema and that shouldn't exist. D6 is all right. I don't have anything particularly against a D6. D8 is horrible. The D10 is disgusting. It is not a platonic solid and shouldn't be in the dice collection except as a D100. The D20 is an okay dice, but it has its drawbacks. And then we'll come to the D12. Okay, so the D6 has fantastic readability, but doesn't roll very well. It rolls better than a D4, but it doesn't roll well. That's why so many dice have got these rounded corners. But actually, those rounded corners just lead to more edge case dice. The D8 loses readability because it's got a surprisingly small face for only 8 sides. The D20 has fantastic rollability, dreadful readability because the sides are so tiny you can't read them on the other side of the table. The D12, in my opinion, strikes the perfect balance between rollability and readability. Now, that's the principal reason I like the D12. The other thing is that our natural interaction with our universe tends to be built around 12s. So there are about 360 days in the year, which is 30 12s. There are 12 months in the year. There are 5 12s of minutes in an hour and 5 12s of seconds in a minute. There are 2 lots of 12 hours in a day, and there are 12 inches in a foot. It's something that we, as humans, interact with naturally. When you learn your times tables at school, where do we go up to? 12. There's a reason for that. It's something that's intuitive to us. And the 12 also divides naturally into 6, 4, 3, and 2, which is more than any other number within the platonic solids. So it applies itself particularly well for us as tabletop miniatures gamers because we mostly deal in inches. If you play a game in centimeters, doesn't apply. But if you play a game in inches and the distance of a foot is a natural one for us to think in, then having a 12-sided dice applies beautifully to that. And I make enormous use of that in the mechanics in Horizon Wars and Zero Dark in using that relationship between the 12 inches and the 12-sided dice.
Well, fantastic.
There we go. The full answer.
I got to say, you made me laugh with your answer. I like it.
It is the god of dice. That's all I'm saying. If I ever get a tattoo, it will be a 12-sided dice.
I'm not sure I agree, but you're really close to convincing me. You're really close. That was well argued. I don't know if there's any other comments or questions. We'll give another moment. And while we do, I do want to just remind everyone that, of course, we have plenty of games today, but there's other events as well. And I just want to show people quickly while you think about getting your questions and last minute comments in for everyone, that coming up at noon, you can have a tutorial about flocking your terrain with Petra Bender and Tim Peasley. That's going to be over on Microsoft Teams. Head on over to letsrollcon.com, sign in, go to the community section, and then click the link. Also at noon, you can watch a live stream of Johnny Quest and the Eye of Makara. This is a game being run with TSR's Top Secret New World Order. So if you're into spy games, you can watch that. And then I'm back at 1 o'clock interviewing Guy Bowers of War Game Soldiers and Strategy. And then we also have Timothy Colonna at 1 o'clock, who's going to be doing a demo of his game Trilaterum. So let's see if anyone has anything else to say as well. And it looks like we might be all finished with comments. So do you have any last minute words of wisdom or things you want to plug or anything, Robey?
If you don't mind, I would last say if anybody would like to know more about my specific approach to games, particularly current games that I'm designing, the best way to get the latest information and lots of insight and insider information on what I'm working on is to be supporting my Patreon, which again is Precinct Omega. So patreon.com/Precinct Omega, or go to Patreon and search for Precinct Omega. That would be great.
I hope people will do that and check you out. Patreon's a great way to support all sorts of creators. And I love that so many people are adopting it now. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Robey. And I guess we will end a few minutes early, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for coming. I appreciate the audience.
It looks like everyone's all set. And just again, want to remind everyone, we do have more stuff happening at letsrollcon.com today. Check that out. Like I said, this video will be saved. It'll be available on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll get the slides up on letsrollcon.com for people. Be sure to check out patreon.com/Precinct Omega and see all the cool things that Robey is doing. Robey, thank you so much for being here today. This is fantastic.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Have a great day.
Seminar. See you all later on.